Hi everyone, and welcome to another video in my monthly read series. In this video I'm going to talk about the books that I read in September and October, as I only read 2 books in September and 1 book in October. So in September I decided to read 2 books which have both been adapted into series. The first being The Witcher: The Last Wish, and the second being Victoria, which the TV series Victoria is based on. So, The Last Wish. I really enjoyed reading this book, and it's one that I've sort of had on my list to read for a while since watching the series. And my partner got it for me, just randomly. He saw it one day and was just like, oh, I know you want to read this, so he got it me and I read it. And I really enjoyed it. I liked how it was different to the series, and I enjoyed sort of recognising some of the stories but not all of them, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of the stories in the upcoming series, as I know they took some of the stories from this book and one of the other Witcher books. Overall, the structure and pace of the book was very good. It is a translation from Polish originally, so I think overall this is a very good translation. You know, sometimes they can lose the sort of the feeling and the atmosphere that the original author creates when they're translated, but this one I felt very much did a good job in its translation, and you know, I'm hoping that the others are translated just as well when I get around to reading those. The story is basically, it is a series of short stories which is interspersed by this sort of ongoing plot that happens. So you get one chapter which is the sort of overarching plot, and then you get a short story, and it all sort of culminates together for you to understand, you know, what's going on. Each of these stories gives you a little bit more information to piece together for the main plot. So the pacing of it is really good, and you know, although it's quite a short novel and it's all short stories technically, they all flow together. They all seem to have the same pace and the same atmosphere, which sort of, you know, gives it that really sort of cohesive feel to it. So I really enjoyed that about it. Some parts of it do take a little bit of time to sort of figure out what's going on, because it does jump around exactly like the series does, but in some ways the series actually was a little bit more easier to understand with the jumping around, whereas this wasn't quite as easy to understand. But of course, being prepared for that and going in knowing that it jumped around a bit time-wise, I was sort of like, oh, okay, this is okay, I know what's going on. So yeah, I do plan to read the other novel, The Sword of Destiny, and yeah, I will definitely be reviewing that one. Also in September I read Victoria. So I really enjoyed the series Victoria when I was watching it, but since reading and learning more about Victoria's early life, I found that I'm not quite as happy at the portrayal of her in the series. I felt that it was very idolised, and this is exactly what I got from the book. Reading the book, it was very much all her perspective, her ideas, although there were certain bits of it where it was from Melbourne's point of view, and it very much came across just like a child, and it's very childish but also romanticised, and I think there's a lot more complexity to her life that we sort of overlook, whereas in the novel it was very much sort of brushed over all those serious issues, and it was just her acting like a child a lot, which, yeah, I get it, she was only 18 at the time, but I feel like the author romanticises that and makes it idealistic, and I don't think that's a healthy thing. I mean, definitely reading the novel, the further I go through the novel, I don't feel like I get closer to the character of Victoria. I feel like I want to move further away, which I think is a very negative thing, really. When I read a novel, I want to feel like I have some connection with the characters, not like I'm being pushed away from the characters. It was interesting, the sections that were from Melbourne's point of view, but those were few and far between, and even then I felt like he was very over-romanticised, and he just comes across as a different person to how you would expect him to be from like the historical evidence. So yeah, overall that one was very highly romanticised. The pace was good, it was very quick pace, but then again that was kind of annoying because some things that I wanted them to go into more detail about, they didn't go into more detail about, they sort of just brushed over them and then that was it. And so yeah, overall it's enjoyable. Like, I read it on the train, so from that perspective it was good to read on the train, it was just a bit of fun. But I did feel a bit put off by it, and I do feel a bit awkward about some of the situations she gets into, and that's just uncomfortable for me reading. Overall, it's well written. You know, the language used is sort of quite good for the time period that it's set, but a lot of the descriptive stuff is like more modern, so it has that nice blend of old and new in the way that they're speaking, but the way things are described is new. So that was actually quite nice. I did like that. And if you enjoy just sort of like a romanticised idea of the past and you don't feel that you get irritated by her childish ways, then maybe you'd enjoy this book, but personally I didn't. Now, in October I decided to read something very different. I was gifted The Story of Kullervo by Tolkien. I'm not 100% sure whether that's the correct pronunciation of it, but we're going to go with that for the rest of the video. So, Tolkien wrote this as a short story before any of the sort of Lord of the Rings stuff, while he was still at Oxford, and it is based off a story from the Kalevala, which is a Finnish sort of epic legends and poetry and things like that. It's a very short story, the actual story itself within the novel, but within the book there are essays and introductions and other writings on how this led to stories that Tolkien created in the Silmarillion, especially those of Túrin. This was quite an interesting short story to read, and the actual essays and writings were really fascinating to start to understand how Tolkien worked as a translator and how he used that as a writer to develop his own language, but also understand the construction of these legends and myths that he wanted to create himself. Kullervo's story is not particularly a very exciting or long one. It's rather interesting from certain points of view. It basically follows a young hero who is displaced from his inheritance and goes on an adventure only to come back and seek his revenge, and for things to not quite turn out as he planned, unfortunately, and his life ends in tragedy. This makes it not really what you'd expect for Tolkien in terms of having read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion. You expect these big, epic, fleshed out tales, but this is quite small and short and very sort of cut back to the bare basics. But it feels refreshing to read something like that, a tale which purely focuses just on the storytelling and just on the plot and moving the plot forward. You can tell how this led him to then create his stories in the Silmarillion and then to flesh them out to something bigger and finally in the end becoming the Silmarillion, as that is where most of the basis of Kullervo's tale sort of ended up in the end in the mythology of Middle-earth as he was creating it at the time. The essays themselves are quite interesting as they give you an insight into his thoughts and feelings around linguistics and myths and legends, and why he pursued this idea of, rather than writing a novel, but writing myths and legends. When you look at something like the Silmarillion, it really doesn't have the same sort of structure as The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It very much is a collection of stories, but they are much more fleshed out than Kullervo is. So you can see the beginnings in Kullervo, and that's really nice. It is a beautiful edition of the story, and it's a must if you're interested in Tolkien and you really want to do that much deeper reading other than just reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And it comes in this beautiful collector's edition, which is what I have, with all the essays and the extra writings and his own artwork. Tolkien was a great artist, and he did lots of artwork to go with these stories that he was creating, and that's really fascinating for him to do that, considering the fact that all this started from the idea of just translating myths and legends to creating new ones, to creating art that goes with them, and to creating this fully fleshed out world. And this really shows the beginning of that. Like I said, this is a very beautiful special edition, and it also includes images of Tolkien's own handwritten notes and drafts. So, as I was quite behind with all my monthly reads videos, I thought I'd add November's one into this video, and then at least then I would have done September, October and November, and then I will do another video about what I read in December, because that's probably going to be quite a long video on its own. So anyway, so I read the Complete Chronicles of Narnia in November. I'd actually read them before as a child, but not all of them. I read The Magician's Nephew and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe with my parents when I was quite young, and then at school I read The Silver Chair and a bit of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I don't actually remember reading all of it, I just certain bits of it. I'm like, I'm sure I read this because I remember this bit being different to the series and this bit being different to the film, and I knew that, so I must have read bits of it at some point, but I don't quite remember when I read it. So yeah, they're quite short novels, so that's how come I was able to read all 7 of them within the months, because they are written for children, so do bear that in mind whenever you read them. Also, just a note, if you are going to read these, there is a lot of Christian ideology in them, and there is some racism in it as well, so yeah, just be aware of that. They haven't quite aged as well as other fantasy novels from the 1950s. A lot of that sort of stuff is actually in The Horse and His Boy and The Last Battle, so you can understand why those two are the ones that aren't really spoken about a lot. I mean, I was quite disappointed because they were the two that I didn't know anything about, and I didn't know what happened in them other than just a brief sort of description of like just reading the blurb really. So, I was quite disappointed because they sounded like quite interesting stories, but they just really didn't live up to what they could have been, and I think that was just because they were very overt with the ideology and, just generally slightly offensive with quite a few things, unfortunately. But as I said, they were written in the 1950s, and not everything ages well, unfortunately, and that's just one of the things, we have to live with. That's not to say don't be wary of the others. There are some slightly dodgy moments in the others where you're a bit like, okay, yeah, you just said that, yeah, we're just gonna forget you said that. But it tends to just be little moments in the other novels, so it's not as bad. Overall, I actually did quite enjoy them. It felt very nostalgic to read these again, and especially The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, reading it in the winter is always quite a nice thing because it has that little Christmassy element to it. But the main thing that I found was an issue with them is that they're quite predictable. Even for a children's book, I don't always expect a children's novel to be predictable, but I found these novels to be very predictable because I knew the basis ideology for them. I kind of thought this is going to go that way. That, you know, it can only go one way once you know what the basis is, and I think that takes a little bit of the enjoyment out for you. You know, they're still very fun adventures, especially to read when you're quite young. You know, you just focused on the adventuring part and not on all the sort of heavy ideology that was underneath that. And so from that perspective, they are still okay books. You know, they're quite good. They'll always be a part of my childhood, and I think a lot of other people's childhoods, and you know, they're to be respected for that. They're well written, and they are simplistic in a good way that is, you know, allows children to read them quite easily, but I don't think they're written in a way that they can be enjoyed as much by adults. Some children's books are written that you can just read them over and over again, even until you're an adult and, you know, well into your old age. But then other books, they just sort of get too simplistic as you get older. There's no twists, there's no turns, and that's the main issue with this, you know. And I shouldn't really be having a go at a children's book. It is, at the end of the day, a children's book, and it fulfills that role of a children's book. The thing about the children in it, though, is that they're not all relatable. Some of them are actually quite relatable. They all have flaws and they all accept that they're children, but some of them just have ceased to be relatable as times have changed, and I think that might be an issue for future generations reading the books, unfortunately, which is quite a sad thing to say, but at the end of the day, it happens. The world of Narnia itself is actually quite fascinating, and how it works, and learning about the landscape and the places and the people. You know, it's very enjoyable from that perspective, and how each of the characters has their own little quirky ways, especially amongst the animals. I think, yeah, definitely it's the animals and all the creatures of Narnia that make the books interesting. I think my favourite, oddly enough, is The Magician's Nephew, just because I love the whole sort of them hiding out in the loft and climbing around the loft of this big Victorian house at the beginning, and then how they go off exploring not really knowing. And I feel that although they're actually the children that are furthest back in time, I find that they're the most relatable too. You know, they're actually a lot wiser and a lot more sort of worldly than the other children. I feel there's a lot more. I feel one of the reasons that The Magician's Nephew is one of my favourites as well is because there's a lot of world building in it. Although the world building, it gets a bit heavy going with the ideology towards the end. The initial world building, when the children first start exploring the beginnings of Narnia, and before even getting there, like they go to this place where there are these puddles, and I found that really fascinating as a child. You know, they had these magic rings to take them places, and the puddles and all that going on. I actually quite enjoyed that, and you know, that's one of the things that I missed. I would have liked to have seen that come back, but kind of, you know, the story becomes about Narnia. Once Narnia has been created, the story is all about Narnia. It's a very richly built world, which is a good thing, and you know, when it comes to world building, there are some worlds that are just not very well fleshed out, but I feel like Narnia is a very fleshed out world. It's very easy to imagine all of these places and these people and what's going on there, and you can place yourself in a time. You can actually figure out when this is, because there's these different eras of Narnia and they're very well defined, and I think that's quite a nice thing to have in a children's book, that they have this definition of this is the world, this is the history of the world, and we're going to follow this to the letter. And I feel like that's one of its really strong points, that it's easy to follow because it sticks to its rules and what it's made. And so, yeah, the Chronicles of Narnia, they are very good children's books, and you know, if you're interested, I definitely recommend reading them. Just going to them with that warning that there are outdated ideas in them and the basis of their ideology. And so long as you're aware of that going into them, I think you can very much still enjoy the books and still sort of get something out of them. So yeah, definitely, you know, just, you know, read them. If you like the films, they are very much similar to the films, but the films actually flesh them out a lot more, so yeah. I hope you enjoyed this video, so please like and subscribe, and as always, I will see you in the next monthly reads. Let me know what you think, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!